Hello, and welcome to Conversations from the World of Allergy, a podcast produced by the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. I'm your host, Dave Stukas. I am a board-certified allergist and immunologist and serve as the social media medical editor for the Academy. Our podcast series will use different formats to interview thought leaders from the world of allergy and immunology. This podcast is not intended to provide any individual medical advice to our listeners. We do hope that our conversations provide evidence-based information. Any questions pertaining to one's own health should always be discussed with their personal physician. The Find an Allergist search engine on the Academy website is a useful tool to locate a listing of board-certified allergists in your area. Finally, use of this audio program is subject to the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at www.faaai.org. Today's edition of our Conversations from the World of Allergy podcast series will discuss the Joint Task Force on Practice Parameters. We are happy to welcome the co-chairs of the Joint Task Force, Drs. David Golden and Marcus Shaker. Dr. Golden is an associate professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and division chief for allergy and immunology at Sinai and Franklin Square Hospitals in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Golden is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost experts on insect sting hypersensitivity. Dr. Shaker is a professor of pediatrics and medicine at Dartmouth Geisel School of Medicine and Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Dr. Shaker is a leading expert on evidence-based medicine with a unique focus on cost effectiveness. And with that, Drs. Golden and Dr. Shaker, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for the invite, Dave. Always good to come back and join the podcast.
Yes, you're a repeat guest, so we're pleased to have you back. Well, what I'll do, and to help direct both of you as well as our listeners, is I will direct all of our questions to one or the other, just to help so nobody talks over each other. But feel free to chime in at the end if you have anything else to add, of course. So we'll start with Dr. Golden. I think it would be helpful to start with some historical perspective and background regarding the Joint Task Force. Would you be willing to provide some of that for us?
Sure. The Joint Task Force on Practice Parameters all started back in 1989, actually, when Joanne Blessing-Moore and Dick Nicholas approached the presidents of the Academy and College to talk about developing practice parameters and the idea that it would be best to do it jointly with the two societies. They were in the midst of preparing to develop a practice parameter on asthma, and they, with the blessings of leadership, they formed what is now the Joint Task Force. They recruited 6 others to work with them on those first practice parameters. The first 2 were on asthma and diagnostic testing. The group grew to 12 members in the 1990s. In the 2000s, there was some changeover of members, and there's been an evolution of the workings of the task force and how we approach things. So there was a recognition at that point of the need to follow evidence-based medicine methods and to grade both the evidence and the recommendations. And then into 2015, to be exact, there was a significant change at that point, both as far as incorporating grade methodology, which we'll talk more about, and the beginning of a new system of recruiting task force members for limited terms of 5 years with an option for a second term. So there would be eventual changeover and fresh views and fresh faces coming into the task force, which is where we stand right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. But our listeners may not even be aware that the Joint Task Force really comes from it's a joint venture from the 2 professional organizations with the Academy and the College. So that's helpful to kind of start our conversation. With that, Dr. Shaker, who comprises the Joint Task Force and how are members invited to participate?
Yeah, Dave. So the Joint Task Force, or as we call it, the JTF, is composed of really leading experts representing our 2 premier allergy organizations in North America. As you mentioned, the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, and the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Now we have 6 representatives from the Academy and 6 from the College, and the individuals are selected by the organizations. We've had really brilliant allergists serve on the JTF through the years, including several presidents of each organization. Now, candidates are nominated based on their known expertise, command of the literature, extensive clinical experience, but many members also have prior experience or training in developing or writing guidelines or some methodologic experience. Many have served on JTF work groups in the past, and some have skills and grade guideline development. Some have pretty heavy duty statistics, as well as leadership ability. Oh, and Dave, one other point I wanted to mention. In order to preserve the greatest transparency regarding potential conflicts of interest, all JTF members and all work group members actually complete a standard conflict of interest disclosure form, and those are available for external review on our website. And we review those, annually and before work groups are formed.
Mm-hmm. That's an important point. Thank you. Well, Dr. Golden, speaking of the website, when I go to the website for the practice parameters, the description reads in part that the parameters, and I'll quote, are documents that establish boundaries for appropriate patient care. But then it also states that, quote, they are not intended to define a standard of care. Can you offer some perspective as to what the parameters are intended to provide for the readers?
Sure, that can be a little tricky. I guess that's why we call them parameters, because we're trying to establish a range of guidance for patient care that takes into account the variations in practice. We do want to try to get all of our members to follow the evidence in the medical literature in order to achieve good clinical practice. But there are not often black and white answers to our clinical questions. So we try to present the evidence that is available and expert opinion and clinical consensus to round that out, to help the practitioner understand the range of practices that can be employed in patient care, and also to be able to use the evidence and the recommendations that we make to provide information for shared decision making. Basically, we're trying to give a balanced view of the approaches to practice that clinicians can use.
So is it safe to say then that it's not like a recipe that all of us need to follow in every single situation? It's more of just, like you stated, the evidence along with some perspective as to all the different permutations that may occur.
It's kind of like my grandmother's recipes, which she never wrote down. It was a little bit of this and a pinch of that. So we're trying to give the picture to the clinician of how to approach practice, rather than strict answers, do this and do that.
Mhm. Mhm. I like that analogy. And I guess at the same time, it's almost like saying some recipes are a bit harmful. And maybe we shouldn't include those ingredients in this one.
Not my grandmother's recipes, no.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Well, I mean, and we don't treat textbooks, we treat patients. So,
Mhm.
I think the guidelines are great because they put in one place, not just kind of a synthesis of what's known, but also, expert guidance from, around the country and around the world. But they also give flexibility so that you can, be a doctor on medicines and art and a science, like cooking.
Mhm. Yeah.
But we do try to provide those parameters for consistency in practice. We also try to identify and avoid the outliers, so to speak, and identify ways in which we should try to be sure that we are following good practice and scientific evidence when we see our patients.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's something that we might get into, during our conversations, Dave. But shared decision making is something that comes up quite a bit, and it's important. And shared decision making kind of is where the allergist is, or the provider is the expert in the science of it, so to speak, and then the patient is the expert in their own context. And that's really important because a lot of what we do in allergy, may depend on preference-sensitive care on the part of the patient. But an important point is that in order to kind of really engage in shared decision-making, you need to really be at equipoise, which means, there needs to be some area where preference-sensitive care really plays a role. For instance, there are areas in medicine where things are not so preference sensitive, for instance, aspirin after a heart attack. that's not particularly a patient preference sensitive intervention. Or care for, some serious malignancies may not be as preference sensitive. But many of the things we care for in allergy, many of the conditions we treat and the problems patients come to us asking for help with, do have a patient preference sensitive component. And that's why many of our guidelines may make, more conditional recommendations and kind of give that navigational signal for shared decision making.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, the recommendations that we make really have to start somewhere, and this is where the term evidence-based medicine comes in. And Dr. Shaker, I think this definition and the meaning of that are often lost in translation. So, can you help us understand what this actually means and why it's important?
Yeah, evidence-based medicine or EBM. We kind of, medical practice has kind of gone through phases. And the phase before shared decision making, SDM, was evidence-based medicine, EBM, and they're not polar opposites. So evidence-based medicine, has been defined as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence and medical decisions about the care of individual patients. And it kind of gets to, a lot of, what we've been talking about, which is the idea of, using the literature and best evidence to inform our practice. It's that translation of what folks do in the lab and at the bedside to, my individual patient. And so practice parameters, are definitely based on evidence-based medicine. That's the foundation of where we begin. But evidence-based medicine is just that. It is the place where we begin. And, around that EBM, practice parameters are kind of designed and written to provide guidance to the clinician. They are intended to provide clinically actionable recommendations. Within that context, parameters might also go into some additional information such as pathophysiology or genetics or evolving research, to understand the broader context of clinical recommendations. But they really are, written as, to support clinical recommendations. They're not like a large review article or textbooks, even though some of the parameters can be quite lengthy, just because some of the medicine that we practice in allergy is quite complicated. But they are really intended as venues for clinically actionable recommendations.
The importance, I'll just add that the importance of EBM can't be overstated because I think we're starting to forget that it just wasn't always that way. When the task force started in 1989 and into the 90s, it was about experts in the field sitting down at a table and sharing their knowledge and experience and saying, well, we know what to do because we know what to do. And we've always done it that way. Or we have done certain research and we know what to do, as opposed to saying we have scoured the literature for all the available evidence and considered all of that information before we make a recommendation. And I think that's the important thing, is to really have a handle on all the available evidence and not just what we think we know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. The task force publishes two types of parameters: grade parameters and traditional parameters, but they're both based on EBM. They're both driven not just from expert consensus opinion, but also from best evidence from reviews of the literature.
Well, along those lines, Dr. Golden, over the last 30 years, how many different types of practice parameters have been published, and where can people access them?
Since the first practice parameter, which was on asthma in 1995, we've actually published, as of this date, 57 practice parameters, all of which, every one of them, can be accessed on our website, allergyparameters.org, which I encourage everyone to visit. There's a lot of very good information there, which maybe we'll come back to. But to answer your question, those 57 practice parameters cover about 16 broad areas of our specialty. I think I can probably mention most of them: rhinitis, urticaria, angioedema, immunodeficiency, anaphylaxis, diagnostic testing, immunotherapy, vaccines, drug allergy, food allergy, sinusitis, contact dermatitis, atopic dermatitis, environmental allergens, and insect allergy. I might have left one out, but those areas are the ones that we continue to cover. Our mission now is to actually continually update our practice parameters in all of those areas when there is new evidence or new practices that will impact the way we take care of our patients. And those updates, as Dr. Shaker was mentioning, as we update each practice parameter, that update can take the form either of a broad traditional practice parameter in which we cover the entire area, all of those 16 areas that I mentioned. Any one of them can be covered in its entirety in a traditional practice parameter. Some of our updates are focused traditional practice parameters, so they're still traditional, but they're focused on a small part of an area. For example, we did one a few years ago on sublingual immunotherapy, which was actually an update to the immunotherapy practice parameter, but only covered that one small part of the area. And we are now engaged in updating many of our practice parameters with grade-based practice parameters, which is also very focused on specific questions, but uses a very rigorous approach to gathering and analyzing the evidence to develop recommendations.
Hmm. Well, Dr. Shaker, how does the Joint Task Force decide where to focus their efforts and energy on what topics to address or which practice parameters to update? Is there a process involved in this decision making?
Right, right. So the JTF is developing parameters for conditions managed by allergists and immunologists. Or procedures that allergist immunologists perform. So the parameters usually relate to a clinical condition, as David was mentioning, like allergic rhinitis, or a procedure like immunotherapy. Sometimes they'll relate to a specific area of concern, like adverse reactions to vaccines. Um, and the need for a particular parameter might be obvious because of morbidity or mortality in a particular population, or because of evidence that a treatment procedure improves outcome, or uncertainty about what the appropriateness of a procedure is. Kind of like we've seen with some vaccination questions lately. Um, so potential topics are evaluated and ranked based on several characteristics. These include needs assessments of the academy and college, the time since it was last updated, whether the, priority is a problem, the priority of the problem, I should say, whether or not there's new evidence, and, what the equity within developing that guideline is, and what needs will be met, and how it overlaps with other guidelines from other organizations. And the nominations are submitted to the academy and the college for final selection. And then once the academy and college select what topics they feel need to be updated, work group is formed, and like co-chairs are identified, and the work begins. The JTF is committed to keeping parameters up to date, and as David mentioned, sometimes the updates are focused on rapid areas of development, and sometimes they're more broadly written. But we go about it first by tackling the questions, and then searching the evidence, and then with systematic reviews and expert guidance, we can then provide information to the practicing clinician, about what's most effective, what are the gaps in the evidence, and sometimes even a mention of where there might be future research needs.
Hmm. So we've learned about the makeup of the Joint Task Force and the just 12 members involved, and I've heard terms like work group member and things like that. So I think this part would be really insightful for our listeners to understand. Dr. Golden, can you walk us through the development process for a new parameter?
The As Mark said, the first steps are a selection of a topic, which is a joint effort of the members of the task force and the leadership of the societies. But once that choice is made of which topic to update, uh, then it's up to the task force and the work group. So the task force uh, selects a work group chair. Um, and the chair together with, or co-chairs, because there are usually now two co-chairs for each work group, and the work group co-chairs together with the task force selects the members of that work group, and that can range from a small group of 4 or 5 people to a large group of 12 or 15 people. The idea being to engage the experts in the field, as well as people who are not experts in the field, so that we can have all the input we need to make the uh, practice parameters make sense to the practicing clinician, not just to the experts. The work group meets on a regular basis, which is often every couple of weeks, but it varies because there's a lot of work behind the scenes. So they'll meet in conference calls to develop and fine tune the questions or subtopics that they're going to address. So they have to define the scope of the document. What are they going to cover, based, of course, on the available evidence, what's new, and what changes have occurred since the previous version of that practice parameter. They have to develop an outline for that practice parameter. All of this is meant to guide the next step, which is the literature search. Searching the literature would be maybe it should always be structured and documented so that we can reproduce those literature searches or update them, and so that we can tell the reader how we gathered the evidence and made sure that we were indeed capturing everything that there is to find. And in the traditional practice parameters, that's the approach that we would take. In a great practice parameter, there is a formal systematic review and meta-analysis, which is just another step up from the structured and documented literature searches we do from the traditional practice parameter. So with all of that evidence in hand, the work group would then get down to the discussion and writing of a rough draft of the text to support possible recommendations. And there's a whole, it's important to have a very broad and rigorous and multiple layers, I guess, is part of what I'm trying to say, of review. So as the work group writes the text and sections and recommendations, they review it amongst themselves. They then pass it back to the task force so that the 12 members of the task force can review their work and return it to them with suggestions, comments, edits. So this goes back and forth 2 or 3 times usually to ensure that there is the kind of coverage that we're looking for in the practice parameter, and to make sure that it basically reads well to the clinician and meets the needs of the clinician in providing practical recommendations that they can follow.
Mm-hmm. So
I guess
pretty
I'll just
involved.
add, Dave, I'm just going to add, I was talking about review, and it actually goes beyond
Mhm.
that, because once the work group and the task force have reviewed it, it then gets reviewed by appointed reviewers of the
Mhm.
college and academy. It gets reviewed by the members of the college and academy, and it, in some cases, gets reviewed by reviewers appointed by the publishing journal. So there are many, many layers of review before that practice parameter reaches the eyes of the practicing allergist.
Mhm. As you describe, it's a little bit different than just a bunch of folks sitting around a table saying, "This is how I've always done it."
It sure has changed, yes.
Yeah. What's the general time? I mean, from start to finish. Okay, you decide on what topic, and then you start getting the work group together, and then what's the time frame in general from that until we see it published?
Till we see it published, the process as a whole takes quite a long time. From the uh, choosing of the topic till publication can be 3 to 4 years. But
Mm.
the actual work of evidence collection and writing is probably about 1.5 years. The review process can, from the time the work group uh, is finished with the document and submits it to the task force as a finished document, it can then be at least 6 months and often longer to go through the additional layers of review. And then there's, as always, some delay before it gets published in hard copy, but it's published online before that. And that's why there's perhaps a 6-month period initially of developing the plan for the practice parameter, and then 1.5 years of actually doing the practice parameter in the work group, and then another 6 to 12 months of review and review and review and publication.
That's a long time.
And then we
But
try not
Dr.
to
Shaker, oh,
go ahead.
no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then we try to keep it up to date through all of that. The danger
Mhm.
of having this take so long, of course, is that there's always evolution of evidence. But we do, before it goes to final production, we do update our searches and try to make sure that we've captured all of the latest evidence.
Yeah, that important to keep in mind. I think when people read through the parameters, is the time frame and really the steps involved in making sure that it is as comprehensive as possible. But at the same time, you have to end it at some point. Otherwise, it's a, a never-ending cycle, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
would add, I mean, I think on the short end, there's probably a range to these. I mean, on the short end, I think, we're probably looking at 18 months for
hmm
the most rapid turnaround. And then, as David said, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 years for the ones that are really, really large and, more involved. So it kind of depends on the topic and the scope. If the scope is wider and the level of granularity is deeper, then things will take a little bit longer with the volunteer force we have. Through the years we've had hundreds of allergists involved in work groups, and really thousands of hours dedicated to parameters by
hmm
colleagues across the country, around the world. But it's an entirely volunteer effort, driven by people's passion and dedication to the specialty. So it's really an amazing sort of thing. It's the task force isn't about any one person. It's really about the entire specialty. So it's really kind of a pretty amazing thing when you think about it.
I've heard you both mention traditional parameter and grade parameters, so I'd like to tease those out a little bit so our listeners are fully aware of what these mean. And I'll start with Dr. Shaker. Uh, Walk us through what a traditional parameter looks like in regards to the structure. Is there a standard format? And really, I'd like to ask you, is there an intended method for people to read through this document?
Yeah, yeah. So maybe Dave, what I'll mention first is grade. Because we talked a little bit about traditional parameters, and we tried to contrast that by grade. But just so the listener understands, what is grade, right? Well, grade is
Mhm.
an acronym. It stands for grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. So grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. And it's a method that's been used by guideline developers around the world. I mean, golly, like I think there's over 110 organizations that use this method. There's over close to 20 countries around the world. I mean, organizations that use grade include the CDC. Some of the recent guidance from the CDC has been very grade-based. The Agency for Health Research and Quality, American College of Physicians, even up to date, have officially endorsed grade in the grade system. And what's unique about it is that there's this very explicit approach to evidence synthesis. And so while we, at any point in time, we're developing two traditional parameters and two grade parameters, consecutively, or I'm sorry, contemporaneously. But the grade parameters, is we've alluded to, are kind of methodologically a little different. And so, many listeners may not realize, but more than 6 years ago, advances in evidence-based medicine, EBM, led both the academy and the college to refocus kind of guidelines a bit, thinking about the grade method. And it was for good reason. At that time, the Institute of Medicine, the IOM, was really embracing EBM guidelines, realizing that guidelines and evidence really related not just to the type of evidence, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or observational, but also the certainty of evidence and the risk of bias that goes into all this. And so grade allows us to incorporate all those features, and also has a broader lens. We can see things from a societal perspective, and that can consider both benefits and harms, burdens, equity, cost effectiveness, acceptability, feasibility. And so grade has the ability of being informed by really rigorous systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but then also incorporating all these contextual elements. And what it distills down to, really quite beautifully, are very simple explanations. So you don't have to worry about, a recommendation level A, B, category 1, 2, this alphabet soup of what recommendations mean, because that was never consistent across medical specialties. There was a whole a range of different grading that's used. Now, grading's really simple. You can either have a strong recommendation for, or a conditional recommendation for, or you can have a strong recommendation against or a conditional recommendation against. And so, when evidence, certainty is high, and the contextual factors all make it clear that something seems like a very good recommendation, then a recommendation might be made in a very strong fashion. But when there are nuances within the context of a patient, or the evidence isn't quite so strong, or the balance between benefits and harms is a little bit more marginal, then recommendations become conditional. And so this is something that's really important to note, because just because a recommendation is conditional doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. A conditional recommendation really just is kind of the signal that we need to be involving the patient as we're kind of thinking about things. And so, we've been very used to just thinking, what's the recommendation? What's the recommendation? What's the recommendation? But with grade, we can think, okay, is this something that I should be doing most of the time? Or is this something that really I need to be having a conversation with my patient about? And so, when we're thinking about traditional parameters and grade, the core principles of grade that we're describing, evidence rigor, looking at things with a very clear eye, understanding the contextual nature of things, that's part of our traditional guidelines too. But with grade, it's kind of more formal, more explicit, and much more detailed. So grade, because it is so methodologically rigorous, involves quite a bit of time and effort. And so the grade guidelines tend to be more focused. They tend to be very focused on specific questions, specific clinical questions, whereas traditional guidelines can take kind of a broader view of things. And so they complement each other very nicely. When you're looking at guidelines, whether they're grade or traditional, we try to kind of encapsulate, have an executive summary or a capsule of what's new and different, sometimes even a flow diagram figure. So it invites readers into the process, so it makes it a little easier for them. We're also going to be starting with a little PowerPoint, slide presentations. So, when a new guideline comes out, somebody can, go to the JTF website, click on the PowerPoint, and get a quick little walkthrough about what's new and different, so that they're not quite as intimidating when when they're published.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add a couple of quick points about traditional and grade, and mostly like Mark was saying, it's a matter of really understanding grade. I mean, traditional is traditional. It's what practice parameters were from the beginning. It's conveying the literature as we know it and trying to carve some recommendations out of that. I think the listeners have to understand that we've always graded the recommendations, well, at least in the past 20 years we have, and the evidence. But that was back then. It was based on the type of evidence. The type of evidence. So, for example, a randomized controlled trial was the best type of evidence, and that would automatically make any recommendation based on a randomized controlled trial, that would automatically make it the highest level. What grade taught us is that even randomized controlled trials can and do have sources of bias, often unavoidable, and it's important to evaluate all of the potential for bias, even in randomized controlled trials. And some of that leads to this concept that our recommendations may be conditional when there is not an overwhelming body of evidence in favor of a single recommendation. Conditional recommendations and the grading of the evidence may say that it's low certainty or very low certainty of evidence. And the problem with that is many readers look at that and say, oh, well, there was no evidence. The low or very low certainty of evidence doesn't mean there was no evidence. In fact, in many cases, that recommendation may be based on dozens of published reports and thousands of patients studied. and yet we still describe a very low certainty of evidence because there were shortcomings in the design of those studies or the reporting of the evidence. So we don't want to confuse the amount of evidence that we evaluate with the quality or certainty of that evidence. The other thing I thought I would point out is, as we've been saying, the grade documents are very focused. In the very earliest stage of a grade document, the questions are laid out and in a very specific format, the PICO format of identifying the population intervention comparators and outcomes. That's what PICO stands for each question. And that means things get left out. And one of the best examples I can think of is the fairly recent asthma guidelines, the EPR4, as we'll call it, which took 6 or more years in development, actually. And just going back to how long it takes to do a grade guideline, it took them more than 6 years to do that EPR4. And as many readers immediately pointed out, hey, there's no recommendation or mention of biologics in this asthma guideline. Well, it wasn't one of the questions, and therefore it was not addressed. So grade guidelines are not all encompassing. They are focused, but they are outstanding at going over every detail of those focused questions.
And the other advantage that the traditional and grade guidelines allow is that you can have a grade guideline that's very focused and very detailed, and you have a very good sense of what those PICO questions are, and then that can inform a traditional practice parameter. So that's what we saw with rhinitis. We had a grade rhinitis guideline, and then we had a traditional rhinitis guideline, both of which were fantastic. But you see the rhinitis guideline was much more expanded, and we're currently in the process of doing the same thing with anaphylaxis. So we had our anaphylaxis practice parameter in 2020, and we are currently moving through a traditional anaphylaxis practice parameter, which is hopefully going to be published very soon. Hopefully early 2023 is what I would expect.
And some of our own members have questioned, well, why don't we just do grade guidelines on all the topics? And there would be some benefit to doing that, but on the other hand, there are two potential problems. One is that grade guideline is limited in scope, and the members often want and deserve guidance on the broad range of an entire area of the specialty, which often has to encompass limited evidence and relies more on expert consensus, and is still valid in that sense, but it can't be done in a grade format. But just as importantly, maybe more so, grade is very labor intensive and expertise intensive. We can't do grade by ourselves. We need methodologists. We need to be able to do the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And those resources are scarce. And we've been very fortunate to be able to engage the grade working group at McMaster's University in Canada to help us out with this. But there are just so many grade practice parameter, grade guidelines that we can do per year. So we are trying to take the best advantage of the resources we have in developing grade guidelines that are most useful to the members.
But I
love
want to give a shout out to the. Go ahead, Dave. I was just going to say I want to give a shout out to the grade working group, and because that's really the epicenter of grade, the world's leading grade center, and to be able to team up with them in the JTS has been a real privilege, and I think it's really enhanced our guidelines.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say, and I apologize for interrupting, was that I love the passion from both of you regarding the development and the grade process and how these practice parameters are put together. But if it's okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on. I have the sense that both of you could probably chat about this for hours on end, and that may be another podcast. But that was very, very useful background for everybody. Dr. Golden, what were the most recent parameters that were published in 2021? And can you offer any insight as to what we can all expect in 2022?
The publication schedule is a very difficult thing because there isn't one, basically. Over the past 20 plus years, we've averaged 2.5 practice parameters per year, but that can range between 0 in a given year or 4 in a given year. For example, in 2020, we published 3 grade guidelines on eosinophilic esophagitis, anaphylaxis, and allergy diagnosis, specifically for peanut allergy, and a traditional guideline that same year on rhinitis. So 4 in 2020. We then got to work on another round of practice parameters and published none in 2021, but expect to publish 4 again in 2022, including 2 traditional and 2 grade guidelines in the next 12 months. Drug allergy should be coming up fairly soon, actually. And then we'll have a traditional practice parameter on anaphylaxis and grade guidelines on sinusitis and on atopic dermatitis. All of that is coming up in the next 12 months.
Mhm. You had mentioned before that all of these parameters are available for free, which is outstanding on the Practice Parameters website. But Dr. Shaker, how is it decided which journal will actually publish each new parameter?
That's a good question, David. And I think that the free publication is a really important point. That's really important for folks who don't necessarily have institutional access to the journals, and also for our international colleagues. Where they can get up-to-date recommendations. Right by going to the Allergy Practice Parameters website. So as far as formal publication, each topic rotates between college and academy journals, and the guidelines finds its home based on where the prior iteration of that topic was published. So if a topic was published in a college journal last time, it would be published in an academy journal next time. And because of that, it can sometimes seem that one organization's journal gets a spate of parameters, but that's more related to the topic selection and the prior topic history than anything else.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll just opine as well that each organization has had wonderful sessions at the annual meeting surrounding the most recent practice parameters have been published as well, often with members of the task force there to provide insight and walk people through it as well. So multiple different ways for people to access these. I'd really love to hear from each of you what you enjoy most about being a member of the Joint Task Force. And I guess we'll start with Dr. Gold and then we'll go to Dr. Shaker. So would you mind sharing some of your thoughts on that?
It's fun. it that's one way of putting it, I guess. It's I guess the thrill of being both a student and a teacher, and I love being a student and I love being a teacher. And this is, I think, common to all the members of the task force. We move each other, I think, to learn more and teach more. And in doing so, we really want to embrace both the art and the science of clinical practice so that we can give the clinician better guidance in caring for their patients. And I just enjoy it tremendously. I'm just really blessed to be able to work with such an incredible group of people who share these same beliefs and enjoy the same things I do in taking our duty very seriously, on the one hand, to bring science to practice, but at the same time, enjoying the process of learning more at every step of the way and finding ways to share that knowledge with the members of our societies.
Mm. Dr. Shaker, would you mind sharing?
Oh, what do I enjoy most? Working with
Yes.
you, Dave, of course.
Thank you.
It's an amazing privilege to work with such a talented group. I mean, such as yourself and other members of the JTF family. And I've learned so much working on the JTF. I really love what David said. The thrill of being a student and a teacher. That encapsulates it. And then working with colleagues and friends. I've heard others describe the JTF as the highlight of their professional career, and I couldn't agree more. But beyond that, it's just a tremendous privilege, and responsibility to collaborate with others, to provide the very best guidance we can to improve the lives of patients and communities and populations.
Well, both of your passion really comes through during this conversation. And for full disclosure for our listeners, I've been a member myself of the Joint Task Force since 2018, and I couldn't agree more. I truly enjoy the collaborative process and being a part of this group that's dedicated to disseminating evidence-based information. I know the work that goes on behind the scenes, but Dr. Golden, to help our listeners understand, what type of time commitment is put in by Joint Task Force members? You talked about the work groups putting together each specific parameter. What about just members of the JTF in general?
Well, it's The time commitment, for one thing, the time commitment is way more than they told us it would be when they recruited us to the to the task force.
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
It's a tremendous time commitment, but you know what? It becomes a part of my daily existence. When I'm seeing patients, I'm thinking about the questions that I need to address and how are we addressing that in our practice parameters? Do we need to do something further to address these questions? And finding ways to apply the practice parameters in clinic. Likewise, it's just an everyday thing. But beyond that, there is a tremendous time commitment in our conference calls, at least once a week, sometimes more, between the task that we as members of the task force have our weekly conference calls in the evening. And then we have to join the conference calls of the work groups, where we are also involved. Not all of us in any given work group, but all of us are involved. Some of the task force is involved in each work group. And all the time it takes between conference calls to be planning these projects and in our dealings with the parent societies so that we can coordinate all of this and get it done to their satisfaction as well as ours. And there's, I mentioned the many layers of review and review and review, but that's something we have to do all the time. We are constantly spending our time reading documents, reviewing evidence. So I think my wife would tell you it's a full-time occupation.
Dr. Shaker, the Joint Task Force has been publishing parameters for over 25 years. Do you foresee any changes to the development process that you've already described, the publication cycle, or any new approaches in the future? What can we expect?
Yeah, I mean, on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, former members of the task force have included, Dr. Dana Wallace, John Oppenheimer, the late Chitra Dinakar, Dr. David Kahn, Christopher Randolph, David Lang, Joanne Blessing-Moore, and so many others. With our current members, it's a fantastic team. We've been fortunate to team up with the evidence and allergy group at McMaster with Dr. Derek Chu, who's also one of our members. And I think that the incorporation of simultaneous parameters, 2 grade and 2 traditional, had been a real change, and allowed us to really kind of give the practicing clinician what they need to take care of patients. Ultimately, all this work is a result of the incredible dedication of the hundreds of work group members and JTF primary group. We've got fantastic members right now in the JTF primary group. In addition to yourself and Dr. Golden and Derek Chu, as I mentioned, there's Dr. Dennis Ledford, Julie Wang, Ann Ellis, Matthew Rank, Kay Horner, Jay Lieberman, Jonathan Bernstein, and Matt Greenhawk. But I'll share a secret wish with you. I mean, it's to expand beyond what we're doing now and developing 4 simultaneous parameters, and to develop them even faster without sacrificing quality or detail. That well, I guess it's not such a secret wish now, but that's what I would hope for the future.
Well, I'd also like to pick both of your brains in regards to some insight you may have as to how practicing allergists or really any healthcare professional should optimally utilize not only our parameters, but any clinical guideline that's out there. Do you have any words of wisdom to share? Dr. Golden, I'll start with you. You mentioned how you think about this when you see patients. How can the rest of us really take this information that's out there?
The practice parameter is really one-stop shopping in the as a guide to practice of allergy immunology. It comes fully equipped with an extensive and referenced bibliography. So the literature is all there for the looking. And every document is fully searchable. So even though some of these documents are huge, it's really easy, because it's a single document, to search the document for any given term and find all the recommendations and references to literature that one might be looking for. If you could be in clinic and have a question about something and be able to find that in the practice parameter very quickly just by searching it. Um, the and using the practice parameter, I think you have to know that the structure of the practice parameter, we try to um, make it accessible and easy to use for the practitioner in several ways. Aside from having the full extent of the text and references, there is an executive summary for every practice parameter. So there's the Reader's Digest version, if you will, which is in itself really good reading and not short necessarily. The executive summary can be a 20-page document, but that's really valuable to have that. And we have every document has a list of the recommendations or consensus-based statements, as we're now calling many of them, uh, to be able to scan and review just those without looking at all the text, and then moving on to the text if you want to read in detail. And each document has in the introduction usually a section about what's new and what's different in this document versus the previous edition. So that's a good way to quickly look at the changes that have happened since the previous edition and just read up on that. So there are a lot of very different and useful ways to be able to use the practice parameter.
Mm. Dr. Shaker, any thoughts that you have as to how all of us can best utilize these parameters?
Yeah, Dave. When I was in training, and probably the same for you, the practice parameters were the first and the last place I looked, for guidance and caring for patients. And even with all the different, online literature and research we have up to date and whatnot, that hasn't really changed. I read them as soon as they're published. Honestly, I've read them before they're published now, but I keep them close by, so I can reference them in direct patient care, and I do. I'll go into those and I'll search the document when I've got a specific question. I know because I've read it and I know where to find it. And anybody can do that. I've mentioned it a few times, but let me actually just spell it out. The website for the practice parameters is allergyparameters.org. That's allergyparameters.org. And you can go online right now and access any of the parameters that have ever been published. You can search by date, you can search by name. It's a really valuable resource.
The website also has the documents that are in review. So when a document is finished and is posted for review, that's where you can find it. It also has information about the practice parameters that are in development as well, and detailed information about the members of the task force and the members of the work groups.
Dr. Golden, you mentioned that each member of the Joint Task Force is appointed for a 5-year term, which is renewable once. Why are these terms so long?
Why aren't they longer? It's well, no, that's an important question, because one of the reasons these terms were put in place, I think, is because going back to the history of the task force, there were many very, very dedicated and wonderful members of the task force who were on the task force for 15 to 20 years. And although each of those people made an immense contribution to the specialty and to the practice parameters, the feeling was that it's good to have a fresh look and fresh people rotating through. But on the other hand, there is a real need for continuity, both as far as the functioning of the task force. It takes some time just to get into the flow of what we're doing and how we do it. And it takes, as we said, several years to fully develop and complete and publish a practice parameter. So if there's a member of the task force involved in a practice parameter, they may take the better part of their 5-year term just working through one practice parameter and getting started on another. So to have shorter terms would, I think, interfere with the continuity of our work, first of all, and would mean that people who were involved in practice parameters would be leaving the task force before they were even finished working on that practice parameter.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shaker, do you have any advice for our colleagues who may be interested in becoming a member of the Joint Task Force? Are there certain skills or involvement in specific areas that may enhance their readiness and/or ability to contribute?
That's such an exciting question, Dave. Really the future of the specialty is, folks who might be listening to the podcast right now. Yeah. So my mentor, Peter Heyman at the University of Virginia, always taught me the best questions come from our patients. And I found that to be so true through the years. As I've cared for patients with challenging problems, I've never hesitated to phone a friend. And then with patient consent, to consider writing up interesting cases. I'd encourage our listeners to become active members of the Academy and our college, as you yourself have done, Dave, with both organizations. Find out what you're passionate about, and then connect with others. It's so fantastic. It's just a really fulfilling professional life. If you have interesting experiences, write about it, participate in studies, and then ask the interesting questions. I've found such great joy in collaborating with other allergists and thinking about new ways to improve patient care. Certainly, if I was giving advice, if you can, gaining methodologic skills, if you're in training, such as statistical expertise and formal training and evidence synthesis are great. That can be very helpful. But ultimately, it comes down to the 3 pillars of service. I heard these once in an Academy leadership conference. One is know thyself. 2, know thy specialty. And 3, know thy academy or thy college. Following the pillars, can help people become engaged. Engagement can help us all. I always think about the words of my great-great-grandfather. He one of his sayings was "Stand by the good and make it better when we can." I think that's a piece of it. Find what drives you, and reach out to others, and then engage and build something better.
Mm-hmm. And as each of you have mentioned, they certainly shouldn't chase this for the money that's involved. Well, I have one more question for each of you, if I may. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted so much of what we do in regard to treating patients, conducting research, and even medical education. However, we're starting to see some of the silver linings and maybe think of new ways to adapt once this pandemic is over, if it's ever over. Do you have any reflections as to how we can improve our dissemination and or delivery of evidence-based medicine moving forward? I'll start again with Dr. Gold and then Dr. Shaker.
Great question. Evidence-based medicine to me is a bit like social media. How do you know who to believe? And that applies to the literature and the evidence. Everyone has a paper they can quote to support whatever it is that they want to believe. I think one of our goals needs to be to educate the consumer of evidence-based medicine, meaning the clinician, to learn better how to critically analyze what they read and what they hear. As I said, even a randomized controlled trial can have its defects. We really need to learn more about how to evaluate the literature in what we read and what we hear. So to me, this starts with educating medical students, medical residents, fellows in training, and this is part of our mission. I think what we can do better is especially knowledge translation, and we have been trying really to work on that. Our members volunteered to give lectures to all of the groups I mentioned. We have, as you mentioned, offered seminars and symposia at every national and regional allergy immunology meeting, both to keep our colleagues abreast of developments, but also to continue to orient them to the methodology and the rigor of evaluating the evidence and the methodology of grade guidelines. We present and publish reviews. We are involved in lecture programs like the Kansas City Cola Lecture Series. And as Mark mentioned, we are preparing slide decks to accompany our practice parameters. So busy clinicians can watch a short slide deck to give them the gist of a practice parameter, and they can use the slides in their own teaching if they want to.
Dr. Shaker, do you have any thoughts on how we can improve our dissemination and or delivery of evidence-based medicine?
I completely agree with what David said. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, thinking about COVID, as you asked the question, though, I think we learn from viruses, and we exchange. We need to exchange information like they exchange plasmids. And just like David said, I mean, providing lectures to medical students, to colleagues, as practice parameters come out. The key is not to be intimidated. Dive in and at least kind of see what the executive summary looks like, or look at the slide set, and then as you get familiar with it, share that information, not just with other allergists, but with other physicians, who are taking care of patients. A lot of, allergies are common, and the conditions we treat are not limited to allergy clinics. And so every allergist is kind of an educator, an ambassador of what we know. And so that can help just not only patients in allergy clinics, but patients, in clinics, around the United States, around the world.
Mm. Well, I truly appreciate both of you taking time to join us today. I'll start again. Dr. Golden, any last words before we depart?
Just to encourage the members to take advantage of the resources on our website. Aside from those we've mentioned, I should have mentioned that there are links there to reviews and webinars about GRADE. I think it would be great if everyone could learn just a little bit more about GRADE so they can take the most from the GRADE guidelines that we develop. And we encourage input from members and committees of the Academy and College that can be addressed or channeled through our liaison, Becky Brandt, who's the executive director of the Academy, or directly to either of us as co-chairs. This is part of our ongoing needs assessment to understand what the members want and need so that we can deliver.
Dr.
Shaker, I'll give you the final words.
Dave, I'm grateful to you for the opportunity to come on today. I'm grateful to your listeners. I can't say enough about working with Dave Golden. I mean, the model of an allergist and the kind of allergist I want to be when I grow up. Really, it's been a fantastic experience to work with him and everybody else, on the group. I mentioned it before, but the practice parameters and the educational products that are produced by the JTF are not possible without the dedicated individuals, who volunteered countless hours, through decades to produce these for the specialty. Yeah, I want to express my gratitude, my thanks to the Academy and the college, to Becky Brandt, and to all the members of these societies who support our work, in our practices and our labs, our journals, and our societies. Each allergist immunologist continues the work to improve the healthcare we deliver to patients every day. And I'm confident that in this regard, there's pretty high certainty evidence that clearly underscores that our specialty will continue to make rapid advancements to improve the health of patients and populations alike. Again, my thanks to you for having us on today and for the chance to talk about what we both dearly love.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both again. We hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. Please visit www.faaai.org for show notes and any pertinent links from today's conversation. If you like the show, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify so you can receive new episodes in the future. Thank you again for listening.